Hello everyone, Silent here, and welcome back to another episode of Bugrock of the Week. The new Caves and Cliffs betas for the Bedrock Edition have added a lot of new features, one of which is allowing your worlds to generate new terrain all the way down to Y-64. This is of course in preparation for the new cave and cave biomes that are going to be coming to the lower parts of the world. However, there is a flaw and a new system introduced with this new generation as well, so any old terrain or old chunks in your world will have 64 layers of bedrock generated underneath them when you upgrade to the Caves and Cliffs update. This of course introduces a lot of issues, overall it has a lot of flaws, and specifically for how Bedrock Edition generates new chunks and new terrain, it's kind of a bigger issue than you might expect. We're going to be doing a deep dive on this topic and hopefully offering some better solutions or different solutions to the bedrock wall method in today's video. To give you a little bit of context in case you haven't seen it, on the right here is old chunks upgraded to the Caves and Cliffs update, and on the left is the new Caves and Cliffs generation, which is currently in beta. As you can see, your old chunks are going to have 64 layers of bedrock generated underneath them. That is 16,384 bedrock, if my memory serves, per chunk. It's 16 by 16 by 64. So what if you wanted to remove some of this bedrock? Well, that is 16,000 bedrock per chunk, and even using the best bedrock removing methods, whether it be signs or bamboo or whatever, that is still going to take an absolutely extreme amount of time. Anyone who has created a void perimeter before knows how tedious and painful it is just to remove a couple layers of bedrock, let alone 64 layers. To give you a little bit of a better visualization of this, let's check out this one chunk right here. I cleared out all the areas around it, and this is a 16 by 16 chunk of the world. So if we go down from here, everything above, Y0 is normal terrain generation pre-Caves and Cliffs, and then everything from 0 down is the bedrock that's going to be filled when you upgrade to the Caves and Cliffs update. As you can see, that is a huge amount of bedrock to have placed in your world. Now, you might think that, hey, this is only going to affect areas that you've actually played in or explored, but not really. Due to how Bedrock Edition generates chunks and a few different weird quirks of Bedrock Edition, you're going to find these randomly sprinkled around your entire world, even if you've never been to that area of your world before. Let's hop into World Edit real quick and I'll show you what I mean. So right now we're inside a program called MCC Tool Chest for Bedrock Edition, and we're looking at a little bit of an overworld view of my redstone testing world. Now you can see that this main bulk area right here is where I've explored and played and built things. Now you can see that we have just hundreds and thousands of these randomly generated chunks just kind of sprinkled all the way around the world, and you can notice that there's just dozens and dozens and dozens of them absolutely everywhere, and players have never been anywhere close to these areas ever, like absolutely ever. Some of these randomly generated chunks are hundreds or even thousands of blocks away from where the closest player has ever stood or walked. You can also notice a significant amount of area around all of these villages has also been loaded as well. I may have teleported to those at one point, but it doesn't really look like a player has actually ever stood in those. Now, you can actually tell where players have been in your world due to the pattern of terrain generation around them. So, for instance, in this area up here, I teleported to 3 different areas, and you can see that there is a 9 by 9 diamond of generated chunks around the player. That's because this world is on a sim distance of 4. So you can tell that like a player has actually legitimately been to these areas, but a player has definitely never been to any of these hundreds of randomly generated chunks throughout the rest of this world. Now, you can see these randomly generated chunks on literally every single Bedrock Edition world. You can see these in the Nether and the End Dimension. This is just a thing that Bedrock Edition does for reasons. These kinds of randomly generated chunks also happen in worlds that you've only loaded for a couple of seconds. Like this world right here I created really quickly and then I logged out of. I didn't move at all, and this area right around here is like the spawn point of the world. So I logged in, logged out, and then upgraded the world to the caves and cliffs experimental mode just for this little bit of an experiment right here with the old terrain meeting the new terrain. However, I made some separate holes in the area, and I found that this area right here actually has a randomly generated chunk with a bedrock wall in it. So as you can see, when I logged into the world just for a couple of seconds, this random chunk very far away from where the player ever was in the world got generated in the old version. And then we updated to caves and cliffs. That old version got filled completely with bedrock, and then everything around it got upgraded to, you know, the proper terrain generation of caves and cliffs. Very strange stuff, very weird, and you're gonna be finding hundreds, if not thousands, of these bedrock blobs and bedrock walls all throughout your worlds when you upgrade to caves and cliffs. Let's say, for example, you're exploring the new caves in the caves and cliffs update. You found a beautiful lush cave or what have you, and then suddenly off in the distance you see some random bedrock. And of course you are not near the bottom of the world, you are actually quite near the middle of the world, and this thing of bedrock just goes all the way down and there's nothing you can do about it, but it's smack dab in the middle of brand new terrain generation for the caves and cliffs update. Overall, it's just going to look very strange, it's going to be very weird, and there's literally nothing that you can do in this area now because you just got this huge blob of bedrock. This is going to be very, very common if we keep this bedrock generation method. Here's another example. Let's say you find this beautiful cavern, but nope, there's just a huge chunk of bedrock in the middle of the cavern and the ravine because that is a randomly generated chunk that's been around since who knows when. But the caves and cliffs update has also generated around that, so instead of having a absolutely beautiful cavern or beautiful ravine or what have you, you do have that cavern and ravine, but it's got a giant blob of bedrock in the middle that you will never, ever, ever be able to do anything with. This next point is a very, very niche point, but it is still something to consider. There are people in Minecraft who create void perimeters. Basically, you dig a big ol' hole straight to the void, you remove all the bedrock, and usually this is done on a massive, massive scale as well. Obviously, these are not intended to be things that you can do. Bedrock isn't supposed to be broken, but of course we find a new way basically every single update. Now, usually when someone is creating a void perimeter, it's on a pretty large scale, so when you upgrade to the caves and cliffs update and it gets filled with 64 layers of bedrock underneath your once void perimeter, that is a pretty huge slap in the face. I'm not really what I consider to be a smart person, but I do have a couple of additional ideas or possible probable solutions to this problem that we face together. So instead of having this massive bedrock blob that is the current solution, we have a couple of other ideas that I came up with. Obviously all of this have their own cons and their own issues, but we're gonna go through each of these real quickly just for some brain food, really, just kind of working over the problem to see what else could be done, because this is quite the interesting problem to work out as a community. And of course, if you have any additional ideas, let us know in the comment section down below, and it might actually turn into the solution for the problem. So let us know what you think about this. So this right here is the current solution. We have the old terrain going all the way up to wherever the old terrain generated. We have the old bedrock floor from 0 to 4, and then everything below that's just bedrock, fam. And of course the cons of this is like literally this entire video. So the first solution that I have to this is an interesting one, to say the least. So we have the old terrain, which is untouched. We have the old bedrock floor, and then maybe some deep slate below that, just to kind of like hide the ugliness of it. So this is more or less what the old bedrock floor would look like. You could either leave it just bare, and then you would pretty much realize that, hey, you know, this is an old chunk. If you did put a layer of deep slate below it, that would actually make it look a lot more beautiful, of course, and then that would also still be an indicator that, hey, you're under old terrain. Or you could pull like another ceiling kind of terrain generation with the deep slate, just to give it something actually interesting and not just totally flat. So just kind of like, you know, a messed up generation of deep slate or stone or whatever you want to do. And then of course, moving down from there, we would have just straight air and then another bedrock floor just to prevent the void access. And this bedrock floor would be at the same layer as the existing caves and cliffs generation. So you'd more or less end up with a situation like this, where you would randomly find a chunk in the new terrain generation, just random bedrock floor, a little bit of air, and then you would either have your bedrock floor from the old terrain or some deep slate hiding that. The problem with this, of course, is that on a large scale, of course, you can build underneath that, you can go underneath that, and you can do things underneath that, which the bedrock filling, of course, prevents. Now, there's not really that many issues with that besides the fact that you can't access it if you are in a large area. So you would have to fly to new terrain, dig downwards, fly over, and then you would be able to access large areas of this like underworld kind of area, where it's just nothing but bedrock floor and bedrock ceiling or deep slate floor. It wouldn't really look that great. It would be honestly pretty ugly as well, but there's certainly a lot more possibilities there and a lot more things that you can do with that type of situation rather than just having millions of bedrock blocks. If you wanted to try and make it blend at least with the floors and some areas, then you could fill it with deep slate above that bedrock, kind of like how we have right here. So basically just be a couple layers of deep slate going to Y negative 54, and that would just about do it really. Now the issue of putting a deep slate above that kind of bedrock floor is mob spawning. When you're in an old area of your world, you will not be able to access this area at all, and you're going to have a lot of mob spawning down here pretty much all the time, unless you're pretty high up in the world. But yeah, in order to light this up on a large scale, you would have to fly to new terrain, go down, go over, and then start spamming all this area with torches or other light sources. So that's kind of a pretty solid argument against the deep slate. It does have the pros for the randomly generated chunks, but for the main areas of your world that players actually hang out, having deep slate or really any spawnable block is a pretty terrible idea. If you were to fill the area above the bedrock with a non-spawnable block, then that would actually do pretty well to blend the terrain with the existing areas. However, it would still kind of stand out because, you know, it's not going to be deep slate, and you would probably have to add a new block to the update that's non-spawnable, matches with these, and is specifically for the purpose of upgrading old worlds to caves and cliffs. And then the popular solution that I've seen floating around on Twitter and everywhere is to keep the old terrain, keep the old bedrock floor, and then just have a pure void beneath that. Of course, the issue with that is that you can fall directly into the void. It's still pretty ugly if you find a randomly generated chunk, and you can build under your old terrain as well. So this is essentially what it would look like if you found a randomly generated chunk. You'd have a hole of void going down to the void, and then you would have just some random grossness above you with a bedrock floor and then old terrain generation above that as well. Again, not really a great solution, and on a large scale, you could still build underneath that and you could still do things underneath it, and you'd essentially have like a super flat world where you could more or less treat it like the nether ceiling of Java Edition to create farms and do other such things like that. Another idea is to keep your old terrain, keep your old bedrock floor, and then instead of filling underneath that bedrock floor with bedrock, you would fill it with stone or deep slate. And of course, the issue with that is that you could mine through that and, you know, build things underneath there and kind of treat it like a stone block map. And then, of course, you would also have your bedrock floor at the bottom of the world to prevent the void access as well. So instead of, you know, making it completely unplayable like the bedrock filling method, you would just make it kind of solid blocks and just a space filler, really, but something that you could still work with if you wanted to. Of course, there wouldn't be any caves, there wouldn't be any ores, there wouldn't be anything like that. It would be just pure block of stone then your bedrock floor, and your old bedrock floor. And this at least does offer solutions. This offers, you know, some playability, whereas bedrock filling has absolutely no playability and you just can't do anything with that. And I suppose just to mention the elephant in the room, we need to mention the fact that they could just replace the old bedrock floors. So you would keep your old terrain generation, you would replace the old bedrock floors either with deep slate or maybe obsidian, just to make players kind of work for it and kind of, you know, exert some effort to remove what was once bedrock. And then underneath that, you would have like a deep slate ceiling, kind of similar to how the nether roof generates, just to give it some texture and give it some looks and just to make it look, you know, something at all interesting. And then below that, you would have kind of like a cavernous area, kind of like this area right here, but on a much larger scale, of course. Now, the cons to this is that naturally you are going to get mob spawning in this area. However, because the bedrock floor has been replaced, players could just dig straight down, light up the area, pillar back up, and then have no issues whatsoever. Pretty straightforward. Whereas if you kept the bedrock floor, you would have to go to new terrain, dig down, go back over to the area that you want to light it up, and then, you know, go back around and back up. So removing that bedrock floor really does solve the problem of mob spawning entirely. If this is even a possibility, I have no idea. It might be completely impossible to remove that bedrock floor, but this is Minecraft. Many things have been done that no one ever expected. Now, of course, the pros to this kind of style is that players can now dig down and access this area, build in this area, play in this area, and do things. I imagine there'd be some sort of like a deep slate floor, maybe similar to how like the end islands are generated, just kind of flat, maybe slightly bumpy in some areas, kind of similar to like this, but on a larger scale. Maybe some of these spikes could be added in. I'm not really sure what all is possible, but, you know, just kind of throwing out some ideas here. And then, of course, we could have the bedrock floor underneath all of that to prevent the void access, which is also a thing that is good. So you would essentially be more or less getting some basic versions of the cave and cliff generation underneath your old chunks, and you'd be able to access the area underneath your old chunks as well. You know, it's not like a perfect solution, but I think it is a pretty decent solution, providing that it is possible. It gives players a lot of new area to play with and explore and actually enjoy. It doesn't completely ruin the game. It also does kind of blend with the, you know, existing caves and cliffs generation, which is good. Pretty much any of these, literally any of these. Even the option of just filling it entirely with lava or filling it entirely with cake, I feel like that would be a better option than bedrock, because any and all of these options here give us significantly more things to do, significantly more ways to play, significantly more opportunity than just a pure bedrock blob that, you know, people are going to try to kill withers inside of. People will find ways to break bedrock and then create bedrock bases and stuff like that. So this overall has a lot of cons to it, but if that is the only option, then I suppose we will have to live with it. So what do you think about my suggestions and ideas from this video? What do you think about the bedrock blobs? And do you have any of your own suggestions or ideas for how to create a solution for upgrading old worlds to the caves and cliffs update? We need everybody's brains in on this problem because this does affect pretty much everyone. So let me know your ideas down in the comment section and we can have a nice little conversation about good ideas and solutions. Anyway, that is going to do it for today's episode of Bugrock of the Week. I do hope that you have enjoyed and maybe learned something new today. If you did enjoy, of course, make sure to leave a like on the video. It significantly helps out the video and the channel a ton. If you're new here, then consider subscribing so you don't miss future episodes. And otherwise, I'll see you guys down in the comment section and in the next one. And then there was silence.